tougher because it requires attention for 3 presentations. I hope that you're starting to get sort of the rhythm of these. There are 2 specific issues that were dealt with in a hopefully relational way in the first presentation. Masoom will begin looking into issues of gender, indigenous relationships, and pedagogies. Later we'll have a presentation that deals with food value chains, land issues, and also indigenous relationships. And then we will conclude with a lot of indigenous relationships in terms of, well, the development of comunas, which are these entities within Ecuador, and this is how we'll conclude the day with a panel. In the panel is going to be Alejandro and Rob in the panels, and then we're going to be, having this discussion.
I just want to start with what an incredible honor just to have this room full of super radical people here in one place. I mean, all our friends and their families, and it's amazing. And of course, to have 7 brilliant comrades to work with. I just want to say that the last year has been super long and super exciting for me personally. So the presentation that I'm going to give is actually I'm just going to share the story of this last 1 year. And my proposal really winds in and out of it, so I hope I can have your attention till the end because I'd like to have your feedback. So, just to start, so the first time we went to Sandra, okay? How do you go? How do you change the next? This one. Okay, so the first time, as Danny already mentioned, that we came in confrontation with the market was through the Space of Hope workshop, which was one of the hosts was Ministry of Culture, along with Senator and IEN, and of course the friend thing. They mentioned everything, but they didn't mention a very important part of the workshop, which was David holding this really big potato that that was gifted to him, and it's great because potatoes, as we learned from Gamar and Kate's presentation, are an important part of that situation. From that particular experience at the market, we came up with, of course there were a lot of things, especially after following Jana. I learned a lot more about the market than maybe I would have on my own. But a few very simple observations really helped me think about my project later. And one of them was who works here. And of course, that's, but what are the kinds of people who work here? So in the market, there are many different kinds of workers. Some of them are the candy sellers, who are mostly women, sometimes with children, which we can come to later why. Then the carriers or cargadores, then shellers, there's granadores, then transportation workers, then stolen goods sellers, then the cocoa sellers who sell coconut, and many, and these are just to name a few. And then of course that what again something that Zani and Sinead discussed about why does the market need to be defended, and and the tourism and real estate strategies that go behind that, and what exactly the context was over there. And of course, for me, very importantly, the market was a space full of women and children. There are women carrying their children around, children sleeping inside boxes in the market, or hiding behind sacks of rice, or jumping over little baskets. I mean, it was like a playground really for lots and lots of kids. And that really struck me. I wanted to know more. So one question that we did know a part of was where did the people working in the market come from, but which was, I don't know if the slide is supposed to show that mainly people come from the province of Chimborazo, but they also come from Cotopaxi and Tungurahua, mainly these places. But what we didn't find out was that how and why did people end up in the market? Like, who are the people who are working here, and why did they choose this particular market to work at? So the next time when I went back in October, that was really the main side of my investigation, and trying to talk to people and find out what happened. But that kind of takes us all the way back to the 60s. And I won't go through it in detail because our comrades State and Gamar and Maria will talk about it more. Maria and I actually did this together. And but just to mark the key points, in the 60s, there were these agro reforms that were introduced that really impacted the way people were moving to cities. And of course, then there was the discovery of oil, which where the oil companies made a lot of roads, which made ways to cities. That's when men started migrating, of course. And then the 70s, there was the shift, an export shift from agro to oil. And then the 80s and 90s were very interesting because then that's when the neoliberal reforms, as Annie has already said, were introduced, and there were 6 IMF agreements, structural adjustment plans, because of which there were a lot of cuts on like basic services like health, on farming infrastructure, on education. So and that kind of stuff, and it's of course export-led growth. So these things had like major impacts on small farmers, on indigenous small farmers, and but no one took it a sitting because there were big uprisings at that time. Like Ecuador's indigenous movement is one of the most important and powerful ones. It's considered one of the most powerful ones in Latin America, and this is very interesting because later on I'll come to why that's so important to this particular context that I'm going to get into. If anyone's interested, Maria and I also created a website that kind of explains all the complex stories behind why this migration took place and why it wasn't as easy, as there wasn't just one particular reason for it, though there were dominant reasons. So meanwhile, while there were these protests and uprisings and structural changes happening at one level, at a more city scale, in a city like Quito, there were a lot of people moving into the Centro Histórico, especially a lot of workers who were looking for informal work because a lot of them didn't have licenses to do formal work, and at sometimes they didn't even have basic housing or access to loans. Like one of our friends, who's now the president of an organization of tricycle workers in Mercado Mayorista, Jaime Chichidan, he was telling us that when his father came in as a cargador, he and his family used to have to sleep in trucks, and there was really not that kind of a support structure that existed at that time. And at the same time, also the Centro Histórico became a place that, because the strategy changed to tourism, like Zani was explaining, and almost like 6,900 workers were cleared out from there and sent to markets like San Roque in corners of many cities. So what was happening is that people weren't migrating on their own, and even now they don't. In the 90s, a lot of roads started getting built to the inside of smaller villages, to the more distant villages, and that's when women started migrating with children increasingly. And word got around in rural areas that women were having a lot more success in informal labor and on the streets than men were, and especially if they had their children along. Of course, it's because they were sources of very cheap labor for employers, and also a lot of women preferred the independence that informality gave them. Informal, like it's almost like self-entrepreneurship. Even begging is considered more liberating than, for instance, working in a formal sector where they can't go with their children and where they can't do the care work and the work that they're hired to do. But of course they were severely exploited because of the conditions that they came in when they migrated to the cities, and some of the aspirations and these are a lot of this is from interviews, but also from interviews done in the past and in the present that we did directly. So a lot of families moved, and then one of their key aspirations was to send the children to schools and to educate them so that they could at least improve their own working conditions. And this became a big problem because all the state-run schools, children of migrant indigenous laborers faced a lot of discrimination there. Almost everyone we spoke to has stories of violent discrimination that children have faced in these kind of schools. And of course, there's also the fact that a lot of schools didn't want to accept them in the same way they want to accept other students, because in rural areas the standard of education and the quality is much lower. So when they move to the school, they have to start on a grade that's much lower than they would have normally. So for women and children, and for men, like for families in general, what this continuous source of migration that these agro reforms and structural adjustment plans had done is that they've ensured a constant source of labor. Because what happens is that, a lot of people have told us that why is it that people in San Roque, like the workers, are not organizing? I mean, the carriers, and there have been attempts to organize them, but what happens is that because it's a special place, because you don't need a license to work there, and which ensures that a lot of new migrants can come in and look for work there. But what happens when they made a union was that new migrants couldn't come in, and then they really protested against it along with the municipality, and that broke the union up. And of course there are many other problems because of the fact that a lot of people who come to work here still have roots in the villages. So their political engagement is through their village than through coming to the city. In the city they're coming to work and to invest the money back in their villages. So, and also of course the fact that the families were constantly moving. They were displaced from their villages to here, and then within the city they were constantly displaced from one place to the other, just like many people in San Roque have. And with that it got more and more difficult to make roots of some kinds, and of course formally politically organized, because of the lack of time and resources that labor that's exploited often faces. So, but of course, I mean, lack of resources has never stopped people from organizing, and not even that didn't happen in this situation either. And there were many people who were organizing in spite of it, and one of them was the director of the school that I'd be working with, and this is a school right adjacent to San Roque, almost in the same compound as it, and it's called Sade. And this school is, the director of the school is this man called Manuel Ilicachi, who is also from Chimborazo. And he's basically, he used to be a labor organizer, and many years back, in around 1989, he and some people got together to figure out what do they do about this problem that so many migrants are coming in at this time, but they don't have the kind of infrastructure to get formal jobs. They don't have the kind of infrastructure to support their kids in their schooling. So there are all these different kinds of difficulties that they were facing. So this group organized together, and they formed a legal organization that started helping people get licenses. But they also got together, and on that hill there on El Panacea, a friend of theirs gave them 2 rooms, and they started a school. They started a small school there, and that school stayed on there for 2 or 3 years. And after that, it got a little dangerous there. So a friend of theirs who was running a kindergarten and was a labor organizer in San Roque actually invited them to join them in this building actually. But they were occupying a part of the building. So the director of the school who invited Manuel Ricacci and him fell out in the middle, but all the rest of the building was empty. It's this old heritage building that's almost falling apart near San Roque, right next to San Roque. It shares boundaries with San Roque. So what they did was, it's incredible, but Ilikachi and his group gathered parents, kids, they gathered teachers, and they formed a big group, and they occupied this building. So all of them just walked in, they renovated the space inside, they maintained it after that, and they said that they're just going to be there and they're going to learn. And then a German organization came in and gave them like 10,000 sutras to start to actually get going, and they got some more non-profit help after that. So the question for me at this point was that, now what does it mean to start a school completely on the basis of social and cultural ties, through non-salaried work, no monetary profit or seed funding, and on demand from informal migrant workers? There was almost no money involved when when the school started, like all the teachers, which Manuel repeatedly told us, were working on a voluntary basis. So to many, it would mean that the state wasn't able to provide a very basic necessity, hence make it necessary for a community, in this case a community of indigenous informal workers, to take matters into their own hands. And this actually comes with a longer story. To just answer this, you have to go back to when the social movements were at their epitome in the 90s. One of their main demands, led by CONAI, which is the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, was that of interculturality. And it was being debated that in the face of so many cuts to social services, like health, education, so many basic things that the state should be providing, should these indigenous groups, should indigenous communities be taking these things into their own hands? Should they be devising radically new systems that are based on their own systems of knowledge and their own inherited forms of living, or should they kind of integrate with the kind of work that's already happening? So in response to this kind of demands, in 1988, there was a Directorate of Intercultural Bilingual Education that was formed to provide bilingual education in Ecuador. And this was originally controlled by indigenous organizations, members of CONAI and Ikwarunari. And what was interesting was that education was one of the key ways, it was one of the key strategies by indigenous movements to undermine the control of the state. So CONAI had even started its own school that was completely to do with, which is Amafte Wasi University, which was completely dealing with forms of indigenous knowledge and how you can